Olá, boa noite. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Eu sou a Joyce, essa é a quarta GIG 2021, Jornada Internacional Gêmeos, Grupo de Estudos sobre Mídias Interativas em Imagem e Som da UFSCar. Inicialmente, eu gostaria de fazer alguns agradecimentos em nome da comissão organizadora do evento, agradecer à Pró-Reitoria de Extensão da UFSCar, Departamento de Artes e Comunicação, DAC, ao Centro de Educação de Ciências Humanas, SESC, a UFSCar, Universidade Federal de São Carlos, e a FAPESP, Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado de São Paulo. Agora, antes de apresentar os membros da mesa, eu gostaria de apresentar a vocês a programação de amanhã, dia 21 do 9, tá bom? De setembro. Iniciaremos às 9 horas com a conferência sobre plataformização do entretenimento, com a ministrante Lúcia Santaella, da PUC São Paulo, com mediação do professor Dr. João Massarolo, da UFSCar. A partir das 11 horas, teremos a mesa redonda sobre internacionalização do conteúdo, contratos e propriedade intelectual, com debatedoras Raquel Lemos e Luciana Ferri, com mediação de Fernanda Galera Daniel. Já no período da tarde, a partir das 14 horas, iniciaremos as apresentações dos grupos de pesquisa. Participem, prestigiem os grupos, os nossos colegas, tá bem? Já no início da noite, a partir das 19h30, teremos a mesa redonda Produção Audiovisual da Periferia, Diversidade Cultural, Modelos de Negócio e Entretenimento, com os debatedores Kaique Alves, do Condzilla, que estará, inclusive, ao final, né, para o debate, João Marchini, do Love Funk, e mediação com o jornalista e mestrando Guilherme Bellarmino, da UFSCar. Agora, eu gostaria de dar início à nossa conferência, mas antes, compondo a nossa mesa, eu quero apresentar os integrantes. Professora doutora Nayá de Câmara, da UNAERP Unifacef, membro do Grupo Gêmeos. Professor doutor Dário Mesquita, da UFSCar, vice-coordenador da GIG. Professor doutor Glauber Lúcio Alves Santiago, vice-chefe do Departamento de Artes e Comunicação, DAC UFSCar. Professora doutora Ana Cristina Juvenal da Cruz, Departamento de Teorias e Práticas Pedagógicas, diretora do Centro de Educação e Ciências Humanas, SESC UFSCar, e também o professor doutor João Carlos Massarolo UFSCar, que é o coordenador da GIG, Jornada Internacional Gêmeos. Agora eu passo a palavra, inicialmente, à professora doutora Nayá.
Boa noite a todos e todas, bem-vindos à terceira etapa da nossa quarta Jornada Internacional Gêmeos. Começamos hoje uma manhã assim que se estendeu, não queria acabar, com o professor Powell, da Universidade de Amsterdã, sobre o tema plataformização da cultura, e agora, então, à tarde, tivemos uma tarde até às 18h30, com vários grupos de pesquisa brasileiros, né, apresentando seus trabalhos, e agora, então, temos a honra de receber aí os australianos, então, bem-vindos, e atentos, porque até sexta tem muita coisa boa por aí.
Muito bem, muito obrigada, professora, doutora Nayá de Câmara. Agora, eu passo a palavra ao professor Dr. Dario Mesquita.
Joyce, essa parte era da abertura da manhã, podemos pular. O Dario não vai se
pular? É. Então, vamos dar início à nossa última conferência do dia. Vou apresentar o tema para vocês. Então, a conferência com o tema Originais SVOD, mudança e continuidade na produção de televisão, com os ministrantes Ramon Lobato, da RMIT University, da Austrália, Ramon Lobato, que é professor associado na Escola de Mídia e Comunicação na Universidade RMIT da Austrália, né, como eu disse, pesquisador da indústria de telas com interesse especial em distribuição digital.
A programação de amanhã, desculpa, você já apresentou, Joyce?
Já sim. Teremos também um papo com a Scarlata, também da Universidade RMIT, da Austrália, ela que estará no debate ao final da conferência. A Scarlata é assistente de pesquisa da Universidade RMIT e candidata ao doutorado da Escola de Cultura e Comunicação da Universidade de Melbourne. Sua pesquisa considera as conquistas e limitações evidentes na história recente da televisão online na Austrália, particularmente no que se refere à produção e pesquisa local de drama. E mediando essa conversa, teremos a pesquisadora Claudia Erthal, da UFSCar, jornalista, documentarista, com 30 anos de experiência em criação, roteiro, edição e direção de conteúdo para TV, cinema e internet. É pesquisadora e pós-doutoranda de comunicação na área de plataformização da cultura e vida digital pela UFSCar. Doutora e mestre em meios e processos audiovisuais na Escola de Comunicação e Artes da Universidade de São Paulo e mestre em filme e vídeo independente pela Universidade de Londres. Graduada em jornalismo pela Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina e ainda mediando o professor doutor João Carlos Massarolo, que é coordenador do Grupo Gêmeos, cineasta, professor universitário, doutor em cinema pela USP. Atualmente é professor associado da Universidade Federal de São Carlos e pesquisa narrativa, transmídia e mídias locativas. Mais uma vez, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Obrigada, tenham todos uma ótima conferência.
Good evening. I'm Ramon Lobato from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm here with Scarlata, my co-author and co-presenter. And so thank you all for joining us. We're very pleased to be part of this excellent event, and we're looking forward to the dialogue with you all. I'd like to begin by thanking João for the invitation to be part of this. We're very pleased to receive that invitation and to join you all, and just wanted to congratulate João and all the other organisers for the excellent work you've done pulling together such an impressive and interesting event in such a challenging time for us all. So it's really terrific, the spread of kind of ideas that we'll be hearing in the next few days. Okay, so this presentation is about SVOD originals. So SVOD meaning subscription video on demand service. And what we're interested in doing in this talk is kind of thinking through what is the SVOD original as a kind of category of cultural production? What has it been up till now, and what might it be in the future? And then we're also going to present a case study of the SVOD originals that have been produced in Australia. So we're looking at one particular national market as a kind of lens through which to consider some larger questions about this particular kind of category of audiovisual and cultural production. So I'll be doing the first half of the talk, which is about SVOD originals and their relationship to different kinds of production strategies of different SVOD services. And then I'll hand over to Alexa for the second half, which will be looking at the Australian case. Okay, so the backdrop of this project is a research project that have been doing with our wonderful colleagues at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. So that's Amanda Lotz and Stuart Cunningham. And we just want to thank Amanda and Stuart for the excellent collaboration over the last few years, which has strongly kind of informed what we'll be presenting today. And it's terrific that Amanda will be speaking later in the conference as well too. So the focus of this project has been about how different kinds of SVOD services have entered national markets. and how they compete, coexist, and collaborate with different kinds of media institutions in those markets. So we're looking at Australia, which is the market that we know best because we live here, but we also work with colleagues overseas to try to compare and contrast the patterns that we're seeing here and to see how things are playing out internationally as well. All right, so with no further ado, we'll get started. As I mentioned, I'll be speaking through the first half of the talk before handing over to Alexa. And so the next few slides, we'll be looking at SVOD's original production and national markets. All right, so what is an SVOD? So let me offer a little bit more detail about some definitional questions around SVODs and SVOD original. SVOD, as I mentioned before, stands for Subscription Video on Demand Service, a streaming app or other internet distributed video service for which people pay for a catalogue or a library of content on a monthly or annual basis. So at present, there are more than 200 different SVODs operating around the world, including the global multi-territory services, Netflix, Disney+, Apple TV+, Amazon Prime Video, as well as a kind of growing array of national and regional SVODs. Blim in Mexico, Stan in Australia, Viaplay in the Nordic region, Blue TV in Turkey, Globoplay in Brazil, so on. Of course, Netflix has a very important place in this category. Netflix is the most established and the most well-known SVOD, the most active SVOD producer by some distance, and the one that has most aggressively and extensively internationalized. And this is a process which I describe in a bit more detail in my book, Netflix Nations, which looks at the history of Netflix and its evolution from a US media service into a transnational media service. Netflix is a service which has come to define many of the industrial and cultural categories that we now use to think about video and about television. One of the implications of Netflix's global growth is that our conceptual frameworks for thinking about SVOD have been strongly influenced by the particularities of Netflix, to the point where terms like SVOD and even streaming are often kind of used synonymously with the particular business model and industrial model of Netflix. But I guess what we'd like to suggest is that this model is actually specific rather than general. So when thinking about SVOD originals, we may need to kind of continue to interrogate some of those assumptions. So SVOD originals, if we take the period from the start of last year, from January 2020 up to the present day, there has been about 1,500 SVOD originals released on services worldwide. So about half of these have been produced and released by Netflix. The other half is a mix of different services, including big players like Amazon, through to smaller national or genre-based services like, say, Shudder or Hayu and so forth, that might produce and release very small numbers of originals. Okay. Globoplay is also an important player kind of in the national kind of SVOD market as well too. Now, the term original is complex and contested and means many different things for many different people. And for some very good analysis of this, I'd direct you to Matthew Ball, who is a former Amazon executive who's now a kind of industry analyst of the streaming world, as well as scholars including Amanda Lotz, Tim Ratz, Luca Barra, and others. We won't go into detail today about what that means, but we kind of might hold that topic for discussion later on or for another time. Okay, so that's just some numbers on what the SVOD original production landscape looks like worldwide at the moment. Now let's have a think about the content of these originals. As we've suggested, the idea of an SVOD original has until now often been understood in terms of its difference from conventional broadcast or pay TV production. A lot of the current literature on SVODs has been concerned with diagnosing these differences. Since Netflix began producing its own original content, most notably with House of Cards, but also many other shows, Stranger Things, The Crown, In Brazil, or Mecanismo, for example, there has been an assumption, a fair assumption, that these shows are in important ways kind of liberated from the strictures of linear TV production, and especially the strictures of broadcast. SVOD originals are understood to be more complex, more expensive, more premium. They're more like cinema, or at the very least, more like premium cable. So Levine and Newman, in their excellent book, Legitimating Television, which talks about a kind of slightly earlier historical moment with premium cable, but which nonetheless has very good lessons for SVOD, they refer to this as a process of cinematization. So we've heard these observations and these claims many times, of course, from critics, from directors, from audiences. You know, the common claim that we're kind of living through a new golden age of television, a renaissance of television, or a kind of maturation of television into its hitherto unrealized potential as an expressive medium. Okay. But just as a side note, the question of to what extent this is an SVOD specific phenomenon is a very interesting one. So, for example, Levine and Newman trace this process back much further to HBO and to other services. A similar argument is made by Luca Barra and Massimo Scaglione and the other contributors to the excellent book, A European Television Fiction Renaissance, which came out last year, which emphasizes the role of European pay TV operators, so Sky, Canal Plus, and so forth, in building that tradition of premium drama and kind of laying the foundations for what we now associate with services like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video. So there's an interesting kind of genealogy there. It's not as simple as the idea that you know, this is all due to streaming. The roots of this go back much further. But nonetheless, I guess our point here is that many of this particular type of television production, premium, scripted, drama, and comedy in particular, are now strongly associated with SVODs, to the point at which SVOD is kind of understood to be the natural home of these premium genres now. Okay. But, of course, there's more to the story. And what we now need to think about is, as we are entering a moment in which we are moving from a kind of unipolar world of kind of global Netflix into a multipolar world of a very complicated landscape of different SVOD services competing with each other and with other kinds of TV services outside that SVOD category. As we're moving into this new landscape, what is the future of the SVOD original? Okay. And so there are some complicating factors here that need to be taken into account. Firstly, the kind of proliferation of services has implications for the production models used by those services. Just to make a very complicated story very brief, you know, we're talking about multiple kinds of SVOD services with different kinds of production strategies. There are nationally focused broadcast and pay TV SVOD spin-off services, which are basically ways for existing pay TV operators to repackage some of their offerings as streaming services. So this is the kind of model used by Stan in Australia, arguably by Global Play in Brazil, and so forth. So that's one type of model which comes out of you know, pay TV tradition. Of course, that's quite a different business model from Netflix on the one hand, but also from Amazon and Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV Plus, in which video is part of a larger industrial strategy, in which originals are the kind of loss leader for bringing people into a larger commercial ecosystem. So the production model of those kinds of services is fundamentally different, and I guess the amount of money that they have to invest is also different and considerably larger than a lot of the pay TV based SVOD services. Other kinds of SVODs, niche genre-based SVODs like Shudder, for horror, Acorn for crime, and so forth, which produce a small number of kind of signature originals. Again, slightly, different model from Netflix, and certainly different model from the more broad-based national pay TV SVODs. And then we haven't even, started talking about Chinese services, which such as Tencent Video, Youku, and so forth, which integrate AVOD, SVOD, TVOD, and many other kind of models together in the one platform, and which have a very, very complicated dynamic ecosystem, which actually doesn't look a lot like the kind of US-based global streaming ecosystem that we've been talking about up to date. And so, look, it's a topic for another day. But our point here is that the category of SVOD is now increasingly complex, increasingly fragmented, and that different kinds of services have different kinds of production strategies, not all of which involve premium, high-end adult kind of originals that we've come to associate with Netflix in particular. Another point that Alexa will touch on shortly is the genre mix of originals too. So we've seen SVOD services in general start to produce in genres that have been associated up till now with broadcast TV. So reality TV is now the third largest genre for Netflix, for example, in terms of titles produced each year. This is very significant, really. It's kind of a return to some of the norms and expectations of broadcast. Sports is another important example. So both live sports and also sport documentaries are an important kind of strategy for many SVOD services. All of this takes us further away from that idea of the kind of premium scripted adult drama, the House of Cards model, you might say, and into a more kind of complex and surprising kind of moment in SVOD production that is in some ways perhaps more continuous with old television than we might expect. Okay, so yeah, pointing here to the continuities as well as the changes. All right, so finally, how can we come to terms with the kind of with SVOD originals, with the output of particular services or with the output of particular national markets? There's a few different kind of ways we can research this. And so in our project, we've used a mix of different methods, ranging from case studies of particular shows, content analysis of particular national markets, Australia, Alexa will talk about that in a moment, through to interviews with producers of originals to get the kind of backstory to those shows and to have a better understanding of the kinds of production strategies that lie behind them. So it's still, all this work is still underway. It's been slightly delayed by a pandemic, but we've greatly enjoyed doing it. And what it's helped us to do, I guess, is think through those questions of change and continuity. How different are the SVODs originals being produced in different markets? How different are they really from what has come before? And also, where is the continuity? What parts of TV are actually, relatively stable? Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Alexa, who'll take us through her findings around looking at the output of the SVOD services operating in Australia to date. Thank you, Alexa.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alexa Scarlata. Thank you so much again for inviting us to tell you about our research. I'm now going to delve into a case study of Australian SVOD originals to assess both change and continuity within this national market. We're really interested in how what we've seen play out locally in Australia either resonates or potentially clashes with what's been produced by SVODs in Brazil. Thanks, Ramon. Next slide. It's important to begin, of course, with a bit of context. The last 5 years has been a period of profound disruption for legacy TV in Australia. The take-up of SVOD services has been both rapid and significant here. Last year, Ampere analysis identified Australia as the most highly penetrated Netflix market in the world, available in some 63% of homes as compared to 50% in the US. More recently, and largely attributed to the impact of the pandemic, of course, market researchers Roy Morgan have estimated that pay TV and subscription services are now used by at least 17.3 million Australians, almost 70% of the population. There are now numerous SVODs available here, some of which you can see on this slide. And these vary in size, of course, but also geographic reach, library specificity, content ownership, and corporate origin. While they're all SVODs, it's safe to say that these have more differences than similarities. Netflix is currently the SVOD market leader in Australia, followed by local outfit Stan, which is owned by the oldest Australian commercial broadcaster Nine, then Amazon Prime Video and Disney+. A relatively concurrent influx of SVOD players at around the beginning of 2015 may have dramatically reconfigured Australia's television market for viewers, but for producers, the streaming wars, as it was just then described at the time, didn't really usher in the boom in local production many had hoped for. In fact, it was quite slow to start. Stan has led the way when it comes to local production, using its originals to brand the platform as distinctly Australian, as different from its international competitors. Since 2015, Stan has commissioned 20 new titles, which include 5 original features, 14 series, and a suite of stand-up comedy specials under the One Night Stan banner. Netflix initially contributed to the Australian production ecology by co-producing with commercial and public service broadcasters, often on shows that already existed, and utilising our post-production facilities. It took the company 3 years from its launch to commission original Australian content, and at present it's only produced 4 full commissions, 3 series, each with only 1 season, and a comedy special, Hannah Gadsby's Nanette. Considering their later arrival in December 2016, a comparatively slow take-up, and the fact that it only began to invest in original Australian content in 2019, Amazon Prime Video has made quite the contribution, 8 new series of varying genres. In total, 32 unique original titles have been produced in Australia by SVODs to date. This figure does not include co-productions. It's important to note that this production may have taken some time to get off the ground, but each of these services and others now have numerous titles in the works as well. Stan is committed to 30 new productions a year over the next 5 years. Netflix recently hired a local programming team, which already has Australian teen dramas and reality shows in development. At a presentation to local media in May this year, Amazon Prime Video executives announced 7 new titles, and they've signalled a commitment to local feature development in the future. Viacom CBS own another of our local commercial broadcasters, Network 10, and their recently rebranded Paramount Plus has pinched one of 10's dramas for exclusive release on the streamer, and it's also announced 2 new series and a feature as well. What's more, Apple TV Plus has been filming part of their drama Shantaram here. Acorn TV recently ordered an 8-part series to be shot in the North Australian outback, and Binge, which is operated by Australia's pay TV provider Foxtel, just commenced production on their first original series. So SVOD production is really taking off here, with at least 30 projects currently in development. It's all happening. None of these services want to be regulated by a local content quota and are advocating hard against one. So they're all trying to prove that they're committed to making a local contribution on their own. This is great for us because it means we'll soon have a significant corpus of text we can use to identify broader trends in the changes and continuities of TV production as compared to the SVOD production happening around the world. That said, we can already challenge some of the common assumptions about SVOD production by looking to the titles that have been made and released by SVODs in Australia so far. Next slide. Okay, so first, as Ramon mentioned, SVOD originals are frequently associated with a new diversity of storytellers and stories. When it comes to who's been producing Australian originals, however, that's not really what we've identified. In contrast, we're seeing that many of the Australian SVOD originals are being produced by well-established production houses or as co-productions with local broadcasters. Like I said earlier, Netflix first dipped a toe into the production fray by investing in co-productions with Australian commercial and public broadcasters that they could then later repackage using Netflix branding in their international catalogues. Since then, while it's not as if one SVOD has come in and partnered exclusively with one business to make all of their Australian shows, there's clearly no exclusivity clause embedded in these partnerships. It's clear that SVODs have partnered with established and experienced existing Australian production companies. So, for example, as you can see here, the Melbourne-based Guesswork TV, which has a long history of making comedy, documentary, and variety entertainment for both commercial and national broadcasters in Australia, has produced stand-up comedy specials and series of Stan, Netflix, and Amazon Prime Video. Playmaker Media and Roadshow Rough Diamond have both produced multiple dramas for Stan. Matchbox Pictures has worked on consecutive projects with Netflix, and Seven Studios has co-produced with Netflix and recently rebooted one of Australia's longest-running dramas for Amazon Prime Video. All of these SVODs have partnered with these established teams to capitalise on their proficiency with certain genres, their familiarity with Australian production tax offsets and incentives, and existing connections with local talent. Apart from independent Guesswork television, you can also see here that the established, experienced production partners commonly utilised by SVODs all have ties to or are owned by conglomerates that can provide some security and scale. The Playmakers owned by Sony Pictures TV, Matchbox by NBC Universal, and Seven Studios by Seven West Media. Roadshow Rough Diamond, which it was announced just last week, has another 2 dramas in the works with Stan, is a partnership with Village Roadshow, which operates cinemas and theme parks and distributes films. Next slide, please, Ramon. Okay, so what's more, while the common rhetoric around SVOD is that it enables a new diversity of storytellers and stories, what we've seen is relatively unsurprising partnerships with established voices and intellectual property, essentially with familiar ideas. So Netflix partnered pretty quickly with Chris Lilly, who has a very established presence both in Australia and internationally, to produce Lunatics. They went on to make Tidelands with Hoodlum. Prior, they made Tidelands with Hoodlum, who are an experienced production house that have an established relationship with BBC Studios in the US. They're known to produce content that can travel. Amazon Prime Video made their own version of the Japanese format Last One Laughing, or LOL. They rebooted the Back to the Rafters franchise, a very popular Australian drama, and they leaned into that Selling Sunset kind of reality real estate docuseries format with Lux Listing Sydney. Stan repurposed established concepts and successes with Australia's Wolf Creek and Romper Stomper ideas. They made their own version of the RuPaul's Drag Race reality series. They exploited kind of local identities and familiarities with a local radio DJ, Matt O'Kine, producing his show, The Other Guy, and Bondi hipsters, YouTube sensations, Dom and Adrian, turning their series Dom and Adrian 2020 into a show for them. Stan has also worked with established broadcast TV teams like Roadshow Rough Diamond, that has made a lot of stuff broadcast in Australia on the TV show Bump. The single exception for Stan there, in terms of their proclivity and propensity to work with familiar ideas and established creatives, is that Stan is the only SVOD in Australia that has developed partnerships with state screen bodies to support new story development, to support new voices. So we're eager to see what comes out of that in the long run. All of these, one thing I should note, all of these services have made a suite of stand-up comedy with local talent, often in some cases the same comedians and the same stand-up sets across different services, across multiple services. So in Australia, it's been really hard to sustain the argument that SVOD equals innovation. We wonder, is the partnering of SVODs with established voices a common strategy, something that you've seen happening as well? Next slide, please, Ron. Okay, so another common assumption that we wanted to unpick is the association of SVODs with high-end premium scripted originals. That is the idea that SVODs will produce expensive shows like House of Cards and The Crown that look and feel very different to broadcast TV. Yet in Australia, we haven't yet seen any equivalent of these kinds of high-end premium scripted dramas being produced so far. Yes, we've had some relatively expensive original series like Bloom on Stan and Tidelands from Netflix, but nothing even remotely comparable to The Crown. Australian premium drama is less significant than we might expect. The success of SVODs hasn't really been around titles like Tidelands and Bloom. They haven't seemed to resonate as much, at least from what we can gather from media coverage and audience engagement and online visibility. This raises questions about the value of investing in that type of very expensive content and potentially labouring under a false assumption that this is what SVOD subscribers really want. Drama is important, but we're also seeing a proliferation of other genres that have proven to be just as, if not more important, to the local production strategies of SVODs in Australia. You can see here that Netflix commissioning in Australia has been evenly split between drama and comedy, at least in terms of unique titles, not production spend. But Amazon Prime Video has clearly prioritised documentary and comedy over the apparent signature high-concept dramas that SVODs are supposed to be known for. Next slide, please. What we're seeing in practice is that Australian SVOD original genres are actually quite diverse. So stand-up comedy has been a really significant genre. SVODs in Australia have embraced this cost-effective genre of content so much that stand-up specials from local comics constitute a significant proportion of the original content produced by Stan, Netflix, and Amazon Prime Video. They all made an array of cheap and hyper-local stand-up specials very early on in the piece. Reality, as Ramon mentioned, is also a growing genre, an emerging trend among Australian SVOD originals. Prime Video kicked things off with Lux Listing Sydney, and Netflix's recent announcement of a Byron Bayes series, which is about the famous coastal towns' influences, has sparked both controversy with locals and excitement with reality fans. But finally, Stan and particularly Amazon Prime have also produced a swathe of documentary programming. So Stan's exploited the popularity of true crime with After the Night, a 4-part series about a serial killer who terrorized Perth in the 1960s. And Amazon Prime has added multiple Australian examples to their series of documentaries depicting various international sporting teams and leagues. The focus here has been on Australian rules football, cricket, and swimming. So SVOD in Australia has clearly produced a real mix of genres, including comedy, reality, and documentary. We shouldn't overlook these traditional and diverse TV genres at the expense of high-profile SVOD drama, which is proving to actually be the exception rather than the rule. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Ramon flagged earlier, another common assumption about SVOD originals is that they challenge established TV production conventions because they don't have to conform to a linear schedule, because viewers can binge episodes in quick succession. This suggests that there's an increased freedom for SVOD producers who no longer have to abide by broadcast norms and regulations. So, for example, in the US originals, US originals, we've seen examples of variable episode lengths. Without ad breaks and time slots, episodes of a series don't have to all be the same length or meet a particular runtime. The creators of the US-made Netflix miniseries Maniac, for example, described the episodes as becoming the length they needed to be and appreciated the velocity of rolling shorter episodes. You can see in this visualization here that some episodes of the OA are as short as 31 minutes, the next 71 minutes. That's the kind of discrepancy that we're seeing. According to creators, the novelistic elements of binge watching allow for chapters to vary in length, and the direction of the story dictated the episode runtime there. Another assumption is that the close viewing that binge watching enables equates to higher audience immersion and recall, and opens up the opportunity for increasingly complex narratives. According to Bill Kennedy, a writer on House of Cards, binge watching changed the way that they could be subtle, the way that they could lay in things quietly and pay them off later. Writers don't feel locked into the traditional 5-act narrative structure it's suggested. Closer viewing can also result in less recapping, with audiences already immersed in the story. Away from broadcast regulation, there is arguably room to test the boundaries and transgressive possibilities of storytelling. SVOD producers need not target content to a mass audience, but can focus on subgenres, taste communities, and niche markets. There's also often something of an industrial convergence between feature film and high-end TV drama production propagated here. Whereas broadcast TV dramas tend to be shot an episode at a time, not necessarily in order of their screening, and then these are often post-produced individually. Netflix shows, for example, are often filmed in multiple episode blocks, with post completed in one continuous stretch on the back end. According to Dean Zimmerman, one of Stranger Things editors, this approach strengthened the serial's narrative and aesthetic continuity, affording them the flexibility to tune into what he called, and this big Netflix rhetoric here, basically an 8-hour movie. This ties into the cinematization rhetoric often used to describe SVOD originals, as Ramon considered. But finally, given the technological affordances of SVODs, we're seeing not just stylistic expansion and narrative depth, but also experiments with interactive storytelling possibilities, like the Choose Your Own Adventure Bandersnatch episode of Black Mirror. SVOD production, it's often claimed, not just affords but encourages creative freedom. But is this really the case? Next slide, thanks. The short answer is not really. What we're seeing in Australian SVOD originals is that these have largely stuck with traditional familiar formats. This is because unless you're producing for Netflix, these properties still need to be able to travel across borders and platforms. This can be seen in the way that our national SVOD Stan has licensed all of its original series to international broadcast and online partners, often quite early during the development process. This has limited how much experimentation with format there could really be on these shows. Netflix co-productions with our public service broadcaster, the ABC, titles like Pine Gap and The Letdown also still need to fit within the ABC's linear schedule. As a result, episodes of The Letdown, for example, are all under 30 minutes. There's no variable episode length there. Finally, it's difficult to experiment and push the boundaries when working within the guidelines of a format Bible. Stan's Australian version of RuPaul's Drag Race hinges on fan familiarity with the franchise and therefore abides by very structured formats. What we've seen then is that while local producers have certainly publicly espoused the creative freedoms that their SVOD commission has proffered, Australian SVOD production largely still needs to travel across platforms and abide by formats. These are still very much examples of TV as we've long known it. Next slide, thanks. Okay, finally, an interesting aside that we thought we wanted to cover today is the consideration of questions about authenticity and localization that surround SVOD originals, especially those made by multinational servers. Managing a balance between international legibility and local specificity has long been a challenge for small nation TV production and is acknowledged to some extent in the way Netflix explained its approach to producing global originals. Netflix Chief Content Officer, or now CEO actually, Ted Sarandos, has stated that the most successful originals, such as the Spanish series Money Heist, are those that are super authentically local and really satisfying for the viewers, starting in the home country and then expanding around the world. Other staff have similarly observed that the more local that we are and the more specific we are, the more universal we actually are. And they've spoken of the company's desire to produce familiar genres with a local sheen and some level of cultural specificity and realness. While this approach reflects a well-established model of international TV production, kind of produce in one nation, sell into international markets, the key difference is that Netflix is a global platform seeking to compete in 190 countries simultaneously, and which is increasingly multinational in its production strategy. The answer then to the question, what is a local SVOD production, is from what we've seen, that there is no uniform approach to balancing local and global elements evident in Australian originals, SVOD originals. What we have here is a variety of approaches that respectively exploit, manage, target, and even kind of entirely avoid localism entirely. So first we see examples of very local originals like Amazon Prime Video's Back to the Rafters or Stan's Bump. These feature Australian talent and locations with local cultural references. They're produced by teams familiar with the Australian audience and the local broadcast sector. The next example of a local SVOD are those that are very SVOD production, are those that are very local in nature but have export aspirations and potential that are designed for multiple markets. These include, given his international success, Netflix series with Chris Lilly's Lunatics, and Amazon Prime Video's Australian sports documentaries like The Test. Sure, this focuses on the Australian men's cricket team ball tampering scandal of 2018, but Amazon's publicly noted how well that the show was received, not just in Australia, but in other cricket-loving regions like the UK, India, and Canada, which are conveniently Amazon's key retail markets as well. Example 3 here is are those kinds of locally produced texts with a very mixed or cosmopolitan approach, those with multiple national inputs. So Ramon and I have written with our colleagues Stuart Cunningham about the production of Netflix first Australian commissioned Tidelands. This show negotiates a strategic dual orientation in its use of locations, casting, and genre, addressing both Australian and international audiences simultaneously. It's set on the beach with Australian soap stars, but also uses familiar Spanish and Brazilian actors to appeal to regions Netflix was trying to break into at the time. Finally, on the other end of the spectrum, are classic invisible offshore productions, where national inputs are purposefully concealed. Netflix Clickbait was released just last week. This was based on an Australian script by a well-known local producer, developed by Matchbox Pictures here, filmed on location in Melbourne for the most part, and drew significantly on the Australian government's local incentive tax rebate. That said, it's entirely set in the US with a largely American cast. Matchbox had to build an Americanized set, and Netflix brought in American creative staff to ensure authenticity. There's clearly no one model or one way of balancing local and global that characterizes SVOD in total. This depends strongly on, number one, firstly, different services, particular production strategies for each territory, including their other non-video commercial priorities, for example, Amazon Prime's videos retail interests, and local producer preferences, ways of working, traditions, what they're pitching, and what's happening in local broadcast and pay TV market. Thanks, Ramon. I'll leave you to wrap up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as Alexis touched on, what we're seeing here is that SVOD has become a lens through which to look at a whole series of very long-standing debates around television and audiovisual cultures. This question of the relationship between the local and the global, the question of kind of generic change and innovation in production and so forth. I guess, to make a long story short, what we've found in our research is that, at least in the case of the one national market we've spoken about today, Australia, there is probably more continuity than there is change, actually, so that the kinds of SVOD originals that are being produced now are strikingly similar to the kinds of television that we have all grown up with here. So enormous continuity. The originals are being made by the same people who produce for broadcast. The stories and the formats very similar. But this is just one national experience. We know and suspect in other cases that SVOD is coming to occupy very different kind of niches in different countries, so that's why we wanted to kind of present this as an opportunity to start a conversation with you all, because we would very much like to hear how you're seeing these issues in Brazil and elsewhere, and how you judge those kinds of questions around continuity and change, all of which at least provides some opportunity to kind of, I guess, critically interrogate the now widespread notion that SVOD has been inherently disruptive. Those kinds of, more calibrated kind of assessments of change and continuity perhaps to us seem to be useful at this particular moment. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention and time, and we look forward to your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ok. Ok, podemos falar já? Alexa, obrigada por aceitar o nosso convite e por nos enviar o vídeo que vocês enviaram com a pesquisa de vocês. Natália vai traduzir o que a gente vai falar aqui. E, para começar, enquanto a gente aguarda mais perguntas, eu queria começar com você, só com uma pequena provocação. Assim, se a gente pode falar que, a partir do que vocês falaram, que você e o Ramon Lobato falaram, os serviços de SVODs, de modo geral, estão fazendo apostas seguras, apenas seguras, tanto no que diz respeito aos negócios, quanto no que diz respeito às narrativas. E aí a gente pode começar o debate. Natália, por favor.
Okay. First of all, Alexa, thank you so much for coming today and for sending us your video. And while we're waiting for people to send more questions on the chat, Claudia wants to start with a little provocation, we might say.
from what you've told on the video, if the SVOD in general, services in general, are doing nothing but safe bets when regarding both the business and narratives themselves.
Is the question, are they only doing safe bets at the moment?
Yeah, if they're only doing safe bets, or mainly doing safe bets.
Yes, when they arrived and the rhetoric surrounding them was very much about the creative freedoms and different stories that they afforded, that they could tell. What we're seeing is very much a return, or at least a kind of staying with the safe bets of the established TV production sector in Australia. It makes sense that they would want to work with companies that already have established relationships with talent, with the creative industry. But as far as ideas go, we're seeing the kind of use and take up of existing IP, rebooting the same ideas, rebooting long established and cancelled series. In Australia, at least, which as a kind of English-speaking market has long had this cultural cringe around everything we produce, the US and UK can do better, or at least that is cheaper to license. We are seeing very much a safe bet approach to what the at least multinational SVODs are doing. Stan is a little bit different. They have specifically positioned themselves as the antithesis of Netflix and Amazon Prime, and relied on this Australia's streaming service rhetoric, but it's not necessarily served them particularly well. And just before we go much further, thank you so much for having us, as part of your event. This is incredible what you've been able to do. And I'm just so excited to go to my first conference in 2 years. So thank you very much for staying up so late. And sincere apologies from my colleague Ramon. We're in another lockdown and schools are closed, and he has 2 young kids at home, so he wasn't able to make it. So his apologies, and thanks again for having us and for staying up so late to chat today.
Okay, thank you. Por favor, Natália.
Começando do final, assim, para depois podermos ir direto para as perguntas, a professora Alexa está agradecendo todo mundo pelo convite, pela oportunidade de estar aqui numa conferência depois de tanto tempo em lockdown, e também está pedindo desculpas em nome do colega Ramon, que não pôde estar aqui hoje por conta de problemas pessoais, por conta do lockdown que está acontecendo na Austrália, e por conta de alguns assuntos familiares, ele não pôde estar aqui hoje, mas eles estão muito felizes com o convite, a oportunidade, e agradecem a todos. Sobre a resposta para a pergunta, sim, quando eles chegaram, a retórica que estava ao redor deles era toda sobre liberdades criativas e diferentes histórias que eles poderiam contar. E o que nós estamos vendo no momento é realmente um retorno, ou pelo menos um tipo de estagnação, com as apostas seguras, ou já conhecidas pelo setor de produção de TV estabelecido na Austrália. Faz sentido que eles queiram trabalhar com empresas que já tenham relacionamentos estabelecidos com talentos e a indústria criativa, mas até o ponto das ideias, podemos dizer que eles estão colocando junto e fazendo reboots das mesmas ideias, rebootando séries que já são bem estabelecidas, bem conhecidas pelo público, ou que foram canceladas. Na Austrália, pelo menos, que tem um mercado falante da língua inglesa e tem essa longa tradição cultural ao redor de tudo que é produzido nos Estados Unidos e no Reino Unido podem ser melhor, ou pelo menos é mais barato para licenciar uma série lá. é uma aposta muito segura, pelo menos que SVODs multinacionais estão fazendo no padrão deles. Eles estão especificamente se posicionando como uma antítese da Netflix, da Amazon Prime, e estão confiando na retórica dos serviços de streaming da Austrália, mas não estão fazendo isso particularmente bem.
A gente tem mais uma... thanks, Alexa. A gente tem mais uma pergunta do Norlan, que fez uma pergunta aqui enquanto estava rolando o vídeo. Natália, você pode traduzir para a gente, por favor? E depois fazer a pergunta em inglês para a Alexa? Por gentileza.
Qual a solução que os produtores australianos de conteúdo audiovisual estão adotando para aumentar a produção de filmes e séries para plataformas como Netflix, Stan, Amazon e Disney+. Eles negociam seus direitos de propriedade intelectual? Eles reduzem seus custos para facilitar o financiamento? Participam de coproduções internacionais para garantir o selo de qualidade? E, Claudia, a Alexa, na verdade... não, foi outra pergunta que ela respondeu aqui embaixo.
Isso. É do Norlan, das 2028.
Alexa, now you are... Have you seen Norlan's question? It's in English in the chat.
Nolan's question?
What is the solution that Australian audiovisual content producers are adopting when looking to increase the production of films and series for platforms like Netflix, Stan, Amazon, and Disney+? Do they trade their intellectual property rights? Do they reduce their costs for easier financing? Do they enjoy international co-productions to guarantee a quality sale?
Sorry, that is a lot of questions. Let me find it in the thread, just a sec. Whose question is it that you wanted me to refer to? Nolan? Okay. What is the solution that Australian audiovisual are adopting? At the moment, in terms of increasing the production amounts, we have had 3, 4, we're in our 5th, maybe, government policy reform debate, where numerous stakeholders have provided their take on how our legislation at the moment, which only applies to a traditional TV sector, can be updated to better regulate the streaming services. It is not sustainable to apply a local production quota, or a quota like in the EU, as our outputs are so much smaller. And the chat at the moment is to, or at least the kind of best idea in our opinion at the moment, is to impart a 15 to 20% expenditure requirement on the streaming services. That's at least the provocation that the Screen Producers Association in Australia has put forward to the Australian government. With everything that's been going on in the last couple of years, this has all been incredibly delayed. And not us, but the local broadcasters, the regulation of the broadcasters, so they can say, we don't need to be regulated. Look at what we're already making. Look at the incredible amounts of money that we're putting into the sector. Unfortunately, as you could see in those different production models, there are questions around what is the value of Netflix coming to Australia, putting $50 million into a classic offshore export like clickbait, which was well produced in Victoria, in Australia, set in the US, and has no localization strategy whatsoever, no reflection of Australia whatsoever. That's very much the policy concern and chat at the moment around how do we regulate and what is the best mode of regulation. As for whether or not they trade their intellectual property rights, Stan as a domestic SVOD very much operates like a traditional TV network. They don't just export and license, but very much rely on those early development partnerships with international streaming services and broadcasters to sell all of their shows. So producing for Stan is very much, as far as we can have heard from the producers that have worked with them, it's very much like working with our cable service Foxtel or a commercial broadcaster. The producers working with Stan have a lot of freedom with their intellectual property and still have that a bit of ownership. As for working with Netflix and Amazon Prime Video, producers are very reticent to go on the record and speak to the details of those deals. Some have described it as being held over a barrel, and those producers that have been asked, are you being held over a barrel commercially, financially, said it's a barrel we're willing to be held over. It's very much a kind of, we're just trying to get our foot in the door, and no one wants to speak negatively about these services just yet. Burn any bridges. They reduce your costs for easier financing. We have in Australia some recent additions to local incentives and local filming, like location incentives that Netflix very much has taken up. So, and Netflix and Apple TV have had shows significantly financed by the Australian government that you would not be able to tell were filmed in Australia. And as far as joining in international co-productions, absolutely. Netflix, not so much, and Amazon Prime Video, but as I said, Stan, definitely. I wonder if this is the case in Brazil. I would really love to hear if any of this is resonating with you, or you're going, this isn't what's happened here at all. Sorry, that was so long.
Natália.
Certo. Em termos de aumentar a quantidade de produções, nós tivemos 3, 4, estamos na nossa quinta, talvez, reforma de políticas governamentais, debate para reformas de políticas governamentais, onde vários acionistas tiveram o seu insight, né, as suas ideias faladas sobre como a nossa legislação, no momento, a qual apenas é aplicada para o setor tradicional de televisão, pode ser atualizada para melhorar ou regulamentar os serviços de streaming. Mas isso não é sustentável para ser aplicado. E, bem como os nossos próprios pensamentos, pelo menos a melhor ideia, na nossa opinião, no momento, é de que nós importamos em mais ou menos 20% das exigências para o serviço de streaming. Isso é pelo menos uma previsão, uma estimativa que a Associação de Produtores na Austrália apresentou para o governo australiano, com tudo que está acontecendo nos últimos anos. Isso é realmente retardado, e não apenas os serviços de streaming, mas também as emissoras locais estão brigando, estão lutando contra os regulamentos para as emissoras. Então, todos eles, como eu disse, eles estão tentando fazer algo a respeito e sair na frente para que, como possamos dizer, eles não precisem ser regulados. Eles dizem, vejam o que nós já fizemos, vejam a quantidade de dinheiro que nós estamos colocando no setor. E, infelizmente, você pode ver isso sendo feito em diferentes modelos de produção. Existem questões ao redor, rodeando qual é o valor da Netflix ir para a Austrália, colocando 50 milhões de exportações no debate, como, por exemplo, séries que foram produzidas em Victoria, na Austrália, que não tem nenhum tipo de estratégia de localização, nenhum reflexo da Austrália, nada. Essa é principalmente a política que eles fazem. E, no momento, como nós regulamos e qual é o melhor modo de regulamentação. E sobre se eles trocam, se eles vendem os direitos de propriedade intelectual, como um SVOD doméstico, basicamente opera como uma rede de TV tradicional. Eles não apenas exploram e licenciam, mas dependem muito dessas parcerias desenvolvidas bem cedo com os serviços de streaming internacionais e as emissoras para vender todos os seus shows que estão sendo produzidos. E sobre o que nós ouvimos até agora dos produtores que trabalharam com eles, é basicamente a mesma coisa que trabalhar com o nosso serviço a cabo Foxtel, ou então com uma emissora comercial, que os produtores que trabalham com a Esta têm muita liberdade com a propriedade intelectual e ainda tem um pouco de posse, como se estivesse trabalhando com a Netflix e a Amazon Prime Video. Os detalhes desses acordos, alguns foram descritos como sendo um pouco complicados, e esses produtores receberam as perguntas se eles tiveram que fazer algumas apostas comerciais, e é basicamente isso que eu sei que está acontecendo na nossa porta, mas ninguém quer falar negativamente sobre esses serviços, para não começar nenhum tipo de intrigas. Sobre se eles reduzem os custos para conseguir um financiamento mais fácil, nós temos na Austrália algumas adições recentes para os incentivos locais e as filmagens locais, com locações e dicas, que a Netflix realmente abraçou. Então, a Netflix e a Apple TV os shows da Netflix e da Apple TV receberam um financiamento significativo do governo australiano. E você não poderia dizer que eles foram filmados na Austrália. E sobre eles se juntarem a coproduções internacionais, absolutamente. Netflix, não tanto, mas a Amazon Prime Video, como eu disse, definitivamente.
Eu vou pedir licença para completar uma coisa aqui, que ela falou também ali no final sobre que ela gostaria de saber, aquilo que você falou lá no começo, né? Que ela gostaria de saber sobre a possibilidade de se isso ressoa de alguma maneira no público brasileiro, e que se a gente vê isso também da mesma maneira que ela está vendo lá, ou se isso é só um entendimento australiano dessa história, né? E aí a gente tem duas colocações aqui no chat, e aí, por favor, Natália, pode traduzir para ela, da Melina e do Daniel. Os dois falam que, a Melina fala que isso é muito similar ao caso brasileiro, muito parecido com o caso brasileiro, que as empresas dizem que eles não precisam de regulação, porque eles já estão incluindo conteúdo brasileiro nas produções originais feitas aqui. E o Daniel Rios diz também que isso tem muito a ver com o mercado brasileiro, que em 2021 o governo brasileiro soltou um relatório dizendo que o mercado de streaming não precisa ser regulado, para apoiar a indústria nacional, porque as plataformas já estão fazendo isso. Então, de uma certa forma, se você puder passar essa tradução para ela, por favor.
Alexa, Melina and Danielle are answering what we're wondering about the Brazilian case. Melina says that this is very similar to the Brazilian case. The companies say they don't need to be regulated because they're already including Brazilian content and producing originals locally. And Danielle is saying that this resonates a lot with the Brazilian market. In 2021, the Brazilian government released a report arguing that the streaming market does not need to be regulated to foster the local industry because platforms are already doing this.
So it won't be regulated, the streaming industry in Brazil?
Beg your pardon?
So it will not? There is no intention by the Brazilian government to regulate the streaming industry?
No, there is. The government is discussing it, but it's very slow. There isn't any concrete strategy yet. It's in discussion in the Senate and in the Congress.
Yes, same. Okay.
Mais alguma pergunta? Tem uma pergunta do Lucas aqui, que eu não sei se a gente acabou fazendo ou não, mas eu vou fazer ela aqui e a Natália pode traduzir para a gente, por favor. Acho que essa pergunta estava mais no começo e eu deixei ela passar porque eu não estava com ela aqui comigo. Vocês acham que as plataformas de SVOD, em especial a Netflix, pode defender algum discurso, promover uma agenda através dos conteúdos originais? A exemplo da série O Mecanismo, no Brasil, acusada de promover a Operação Lava Jato, Se sim, qual seria esta agenda e se teria alguma agenda em específico?
So do you think that SVOD platforms, especially Netflix, can defend some kind of speech, promote an agenda through their original content? Like the series O Mecanismo, The Mechanism in Brazil, is accused of promoting Lava Jato operation. And if yes, what would be this agenda? Would it have some kind of example in specific?
So just to clarify, what is Netflix agenda in Australia so far?
Yeah, if you could defend some kind of speech promoting an agenda, a specific agenda or political one, or even in any.
Very purposefully avoided any kind of political politicization of their agenda. They're very good at that. There is a lot of rhetoric around their value and their global audiences' valuation of local stories. And yet, what we're seeing is that the next thing that they're producing is a kind of reality series, much like Too Hot to Handle or Love is Blind, those kinds of series based in Byron Bay, which is a kind of very globally recognizable hipster, I don't know how to explain this, but influencer-driven reality show. On the other end of the spectrum, we see sometimes a kind of acknowledgement of local content and existing content, an interest in Indigenous cultures around certain days of the year that are significant to local Indigenous cultures in Australia. There is no specific agenda in Australia, but that's because, as far as they're willing to outline, but that's because a production in Australia by Netflix has been so limited so far. 4 original titles, and one of those is a stand-up special. We are a very small audience for them. We're a very small nation. It absolutely makes sense. But to hear that, I mean, is there a specific agenda, that a party line that Netflix is touting in Brazil? I would love to know that.
Natalia?
Perdão. Sim, perdão. Eles, de uma forma muito de propósito, evitam qualquer tipo de mobilização política na agenda deles, e eles são muito bons nisso. Teve muita retórica sobre o valor deles e os seus públicos globais e a paralelização das histórias locais, e ainda assim o que estamos vendo é que as próximas coisas que eles estão produzindo é uma série de reality shows, muito como Too Hot to Handle ou então Love is Blind. Esses tipos de séries baseados em Byron Bay, que tem um tipo de reconhecimento global muito fácil. E eu não sei como explicar isso muito bem, mas são basicamente reality shows baseados em influência. E do outro lado do espectro, às vezes, é um tipo de reconhecimento do conteúdo local e do conteúdo existente e interessante para as culturas de certos dias do ano, que são significativos para trabalhar com culturas indígenas na Austrália. Não tem uma agenda específica na Austrália, mas isso é porque, até o ponto que estamos dispostos, isso é porque as produções na Austrália pela Netflix foram limitadas, até agora, a 4 títulos originais, e um desses é um especial de stand-up. Nós somos uma audiência muito pequena para eles. Nós somos uma nação pequena e isso acaba fazendo sentido. Mas o que eu ouço dizer é que parece ter um tipo de agenda específica que a Netflix está adotando no Brasil, e eu gostaria de saber mais disso.
João, quer falar alguma coisa sobre isso?
Traduz para ela depois, então, Claudia. Aqui no Brasil, a gente estuda, analisa a relação de continuidade e diferença, mas em relação à TV aberta, não streaming. Quer dizer, aqui no Brasil, a única emissora que tem condições de ter um streaming produz, então, conteúdos originais, exclusivos, e uma forma de chamar a atenção do público para o streaming, para a plataforma, e depois exibe na TV aberta. Então, existe uma relação de continuidade, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a produção que é feita exclusiva para o streaming, entre aspas, né, que depois vai para a TV aberta, muitas delas não vão, pela própria direção da emissora, diz que não tem condições, por uma série de motivos, desse conteúdo ser exibido na TV aberta. Mas é curioso observar a luta interna, né, entre a inovação e a continuidade propriamente dita, né, que a empresa, no caso, acaba refletindo. Nem tudo que é feito para o streaming é exatamente inovador, exclusivo, original propriamente para o streaming, mas eles alegam que sim, tem, né, produtos que são feitos como agora, acho que é a segunda temporada, Amores alguma coisa, que eles não querem exibir na TV aberta porque moralmente não seria aceitável. Os temas, a abordagem dos temas, etc. A segunda questão, Claudia, qual o mercado de formatos na Austrália? Quais os valores econômicos em torno dos formatos? Se existe uma indústria de formatos na Austrália?
Natália, quer traduzir?
E não pus no chat que eu não sei falar a língua aborígene, daí não sei colocar no site.
So here in Brazil, we study to analyze the relation between continuity of difference with public TV, not streaming. The only broadcaster which has conditions to have a streaming, it produces original and exclusive content as a way to call the public's attention to the streaming, and then broadcasts it to public TV. There is a relation of continuity, but lots of them are not for the decision of the broadcaster. But it's curious to observe the internal struggle between modernity and internal choices. Not everything produced to streaming is innovative, but they allegate that it is. And the products some products are produced, but they don't want to show on public TV because it won't be morally acceptable to the public due to the themes, to some of the themes approached in the show. With that, João wants to know what's the economic values of the formats, if there is an industry of formats and values in Australia, and what they are.
An industry of formats. Absolutely. A broadcast TV in Australia is entirely hinged on the format trade and has been for a long time. When it comes to the kind of market failure of genres of drama and documentary that have long been legislated and regulated to be protected in Australia, broadcasters have limited and are increasingly testing the boundaries of meeting the requirements that they are forced to oblige to meet as part of their licensing requirements. And so those market failure genres have become something of the domain of the public service broadcasters in Australia, who are increasingly having their budgets slashed. So we thought that the streaming services would fill that hole. You know, it was the intention, or at least the assumption was that people wanted to watch that type of content on their own time, in a binge model, and that it would be the place for Australian drama to thrive, Australian documentary to thrive. It's just been too expensive, I suppose, even for the streaming services to take that leap. And when they have taken a risk on an offshore production produced in Australia because it's cheaper, and we had for a short time, we're able to continue with production during the beginning of the pandemic. So As far as SVOD has gone with formats, I think Stan with their RuPaul's Drag Race format is the standout, I suppose. We're certainly not creating our own in Australia. We've never been particularly well known for creating new and original and innovative formats. We rely on that trade, absolutely. But those local versions of formats are certainly more popular than their international counterparts. So they work quite well for the broadcasters.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Certo? Uma indústria de formatos, absolutamente. A TV aberta na Austrália está, de fato, presa na troca de formatos e esteve assim por um bom tempo. Quando isso chega no tipo de falha de mercado de gêneros de tipo drama e documentário, que faz muito tempo foi legislado e regulamentado para serem protegidos na Austrália, as emissoras acabam sendo limitadas. E, além disso, eles testam os limites de cumprir as exigências que eles são forçados a seguir pelos patrocinadores para cumprir a parte deles nos contratos de licenciamento. Então, essas falhas de mercado de gêneros acabam se tornando um tipo de domínio das emissoras de serviço público na Austrália, que estão a cada vez mais tendo seus orçamentos cortados. Então, nós pensamos que os serviços de streaming acabam preenchendo esse vazio. Pelo menos foi a intenção, que se as pessoas quisessem assistir um tipo de conteúdo no seu próprio tempo, ou se elas tiverem para maratonar, e isso seria o local, então, para o drama australiano ter sucesso, para os documentários ter sucesso. De uma certa forma, é bem caro, eu acredito, mesmo para os serviços de streaming, para pagar essas produções. E quando eles pagam, eles preferiram tomar esse risco de produções terceirizadas, produzidas na Austrália, porque é mais barato, e elas tiveram sucesso durante isso, e podemos continuar com a produção desde o começo. E a respeito de como os formatos produzem, Stan, com o formato RuPaul Drag Race, por exemplo, se destacou, e nós não estamos criando nosso próprio na Austrália. Nós nunca fomos conhecidos particularmente por criar notícias independentes ou um formato inovativo e original. Nós dependemos dessa troca, absolutamente, mas as versões localizadas dos formatos costumam ser mais populares do que as suas contrapartes internacionais. Elas funcionaram muito bem para a emissão.
Okay. Elina levantou a mão para falar ainda há pouco e a gente foi falando mais e passou para o senhor. Não sei se ainda dá tempo, Melina, o que você queria falar?
Ok, tranquilo. A disponibilidade é da Alexa.
Elina, quer falar?
Não, não tinha levantado, não.
Não?
Não.
Pareceu que sim, desculpa.
É uma outra pergunta do Norlan, na verdade, não é?
Existe uma outra pergunta do Norlan aqui para fazer. Eu vou só falar em português aqui rapidinho, e aí você pode passar para ela, se você puder fazer a gente.
Eu vou falar para ela já ir lendo com você, que aí a gente...
Ok.
Alexa, there is another question by Norlan Silva. It begins with the inclusion of Netflix original. Have you read it?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Yeah. Claudia is going to translate in Portuguese for for people who are watching us, and then we begin with your answer.
Okay.
A pergunta do Norlan é se a inclusão de séries e filmes nos originais da Netflix nos Estados Unidos, feitas por autores como o Dr. Stacey L. Smith, Dra. Catherine Piper, Mark Choetti, Kevin Yao, Ariana Case, Carla Hernandes e Zoe Moore, do Annenberg Institute of USC, se introduzem uma forma de crescimento e de representatividade em culturas mais invisíveis, como a cultura das mulheres, dos negros, dos latinos e de pessoas indígenas. E se traz isso mais para frente das câmeras, bem como temas, traz isso para frente das câmeras em temas para séries e filmes originais da Netflix. E se é possível que a Netflix possa, de alguma maneira, corrigir o algoritmo investindo nessa nova estratégia.
Okay, so I wouldn't deign to speak to Netflix algorithm. That is well beyond my ability to understand. But
this is other research, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And will we ever know? It's an absolute black box. But as far as Australia has gone so far with Netflix limited investment and kind of breaking into the region, they've made safe bets. They've worked with established partnerships. They've told the same stories that have already been told. What we're seeing so far in terms of expanding those production partners and telling diverse stories is them throwing money at scholarship funds. They recently announced an Australian Indigenous Scholarship Fund to create development, to develop stories. The problem will be that it will take some years for us to see the rewards from that investment. Stan, as I mentioned in my talk, is the kind of a leader, I suppose, in developing stories. The other services, the multinational services, seem to want a proven concept with established audience, established interest. They are not pushing the boundaries by any means. So it's my understanding that Netflix in Brazil is doing much more interesting things, and I would love to hear more about that. But you're kind of shaking your head, so maybe not. In Australia, that kind of investment into invisible voices, into hushed representations is not the case.
Certo? Eu não ousaria falar do algoritmo da Netflix, isso está além da minha capacidade, é o tema de outra pesquisa, mas sim, absolutamente. E, como sabemos, é uma caixa preta absoluta. Mas, quando é relativo à Austrália, sobre o que a Austrália foi com investimento limitado da Netflix ao entrar na região, eles decidiram por apostas seguras e trabalharam com parcerias estabelecidas que contaram as mesmas histórias que já haviam sido contadas antes. O que estamos vendo até agora, em termos de expandir essas parcerias de produção e contar histórias diversas, é que eles estão colocando dinheiro em fundos de bolsas de estudo. Eles recentemente anunciaram esse fundo de bolsas de estudo para aborígenes australianos, para eles poderem desenvolver e criar novas histórias. O problema com isso é que vai levar alguns anos para nós podermos ver os frutos desse tipo de investimento. O STEM, como eu mencionei na minha palestra, é um tipo de líder, eu imagino, em desenvolver as histórias. Os outros serviços e serviços multinacionais parecem querer um conceito provado com audiências estabelecidas, com interesses estabelecidos. Eles não estão, de forma alguma, querendo ir além desses limites. Eu acredito que a Netflix no Brasil está fazendo coisas muito interessantes, e eu gostaria muito de ouvir mais sobre isso, mas nesse exato momento vocês estão negando com a cabeça, então talvez não seja o caso. Na Austrália, esse tipo de investimento acaba indo para recursos invisíveis, você sabe, mas representatividade apressada não é o caso.
João, Dário, querem falar sobre a Netflix? Quem mais quer falar, gente? Ela pergunta se a Netflix do Brasil está fazendo coisas originais, legais e diferentes, e que possam sair dessa agenda um pouco de dessa agenda das coisas, das mesmas narrativas e dos mesmos formatos?
Eu acho que na Austrália, em todos os lugares do mundo, a Netflix tem uma agenda transnacional. Então, ela trouxe para o Brasil isso em termos de produção, que é uma novidade, e modificou o mercado, para o bem e para o mal, né? Trouxe essa outra realidade que a gente desconhecia. A ausência de uma regulamentação depõe contra, obviamente, mas isso é uma característica, então, das produções aqui com o Brasil. E sempre explorando, claro, a paisagem local, né? O lugar tem uma produção da Netflix, as coisas mais lindas, como é que se chama, que se passa no Rio, que é nos anos 50, da música nossa.
Coisa mais linda mesmo, acho que é. Né?
Por exemplo, onde que o que é de cultura popular, que é a música, o carnaval, e a paisagem do Rio, a paisagem carioca, tem esse padrão, né, de um produto transnacional. E é super bacana a série. Então, tem muitos exemplos que eles fazem pensando nessa relação do local e do global, né? E produções com uma parceria independente, brasileira, as produtoras independentes, né? Que colocam uma exigência muito grande de produção e uma busca de uma qualidade que interfere, então, na propriedade intelectual do produto, porque quando a produtora não dispõe de recursos, a Netflix paga uma soma vultuosa para cobrir os custos e ficar com a propriedade. É um investimento da Netflix. Aqui que se traduz um pouco equivocadamente essa noção. A Netflix faz parcerias com qualquer país, com qualquer produtora, mas quando não há recurso, ela propõe, normalmente o produtor aceita, então, vender a propriedade intelectual em cima de uma grana que recebe por isso. E isso é uma condição miserável, né, dos países periféricos. As produtoras com ideias boas têm que vender a propriedade, porque a única maneira de produzir é vendendo a ideia para eles. Não sei se fica claro uma questão, se isso tem paralelos com a Austrália.
Okay. So both in Australia and other places of the world, Netflix has a transnational agenda, and it brought it here for the Brazilian productions, which is kind of a novelty here. It brought this other kind of reality. And here in Brazil, we have a lack of regulation with kind of pumps on it. But this is a characteristic of Brazilian productions. And every time Netflix is exploiting local landscape, like in many Brazilian productions that are going to be exported, especially places where there's the popular culture, like Carnival and the landscape itself, for example, Netflix has this kind of pattern. And when you talk about products, with independent Brazilian producers, they put an demand of production that is too high in searching a quality. This ends up interfering with intellectual property rights, because Netflix cover these costs when the producers can't afford it, in exchange of the intellectual property rights. And this is a horrible condition for peripheral poor countries, because the producers need to sell the ideas in order to have these ideas produced. So what João wants to really know is there is any kind of parallel in Australia with all of this.
Posso acrescentar mais comentário para talvez deixar mais claro? Natália, dá para acrescentar?
He wants to try to sum it up. Just a second.
Em termos estruturais, o Grupo Globo, no Brasil, se aliou à Disney para se contrapor à Netflix, que é a mídia invasora, né? E há uma proximidade muito grande entre a Disney, as narrativas da Disney, com a Globo, vamos assim dizer. Uma ideia que a gente discutiu hoje de uma certa simplicidade narrativa a partir da estrutura do melodrama. Mas o mais curioso, Alexia, é que a Netflix vai começar a produzir telenovela no Brasil para concorrer com a Globo. É uma guerra declarada entre as duas empresas, e a Globo vai começar a fazer estruturas de telenovela como se fossem seriadas, mais curtas telenovelas, para entrar no campo onde a Netflix é dominante, que é das estruturas seriadas mesmo, né? Então, vai começar a produzir novelas com estrutura de seriados e a Netflix vai começar a produzir novelas no Brasil. Então, há um confronto, né? Há um confronto inevitável que vai acontecer, uma questão de domínio de territórios. E para nós brasileiros só existe essa questão praticamente.
Como é, João? Para nós brasileiros?
Não, para nós brasileiros a gente assiste, né, esse embate e fica olhando, né, o que é, aqui no Brasil é uma questão sobre o que é resistência nesse aspecto, né? É bom não entrar muito nesse campo.
So, in structural terms, the group Globo aligned itself with Disney to try to fight back Netflix, which is the invasor, we can say. And there is a big possibility, a big compatibility between Disney, their narratives, with Globo's narrative. And what is the most curious is that Netflix is starting to produce telenovelas to go against Globo, which in turn is trying to produce their own telenovelas more similar to series, to foreign series, to try to go against Netflix, which is here in Brazil. Yeah, here in Brazil, Netflix is most known for its series. So it's really a declared war. And there is a direct and inevitable fight against them. And here, us, the Brazilian audience, we just sit back and watch it. Yeah. So I want to know if there's something similar happening in Australia.
We're too small. We're too small, and we have no specific kind of genre that we're known for. But I have no doubt that what you described will be playing out in Australia in the next 5 years. At the moment, all Australian producers just want to be on Netflix. They're happy to abide by the very, very poor terms of the contracts. And they are not given any information back as far as we can tell. We've been meeting with producers and talking about the interface, user, the relationship of the user with Netflix, and the producers are so interested because they're not given any of this information whatsoever. They just want to be visible. They want to be on Netflix. The next problem will be fighting back against these incomprehensible, very degrading terms that limit the sustainability of the production industry in Australia going forward. Yes, that's a kind of chilling story that you've described.
Ok. Isso é algo que acontecerá na Austrália mais ou menos daqui 5 anos, porque no momento estão sendo assumidos grandes contratos e eles não estão dando nenhum tipo de informação a respeito deles, pelos que pode ser dito. Existiam algumas reuniões já para falar sobre a interface, o relacionamento do usuário com a Netflix, e os produtores estão muito interessados porque eles não recebem nenhum tipo das informações relativas a isso. Eles só querem ser visíveis, eles querem estar na Netflix. O próximo problema vai ser lutar contra esses termos incompreensíveis e muito degradantes que limitam a sustentabilidade da indústria de produção na Austrália, para que ela avance. Mas a história que o João descreveu é realmente um tanto assustadora.
E o Dário também está completando aqui sobre essa fala do João, que como a Netflix, a Globo também demitiu autores de novelas recentemente, e esses autores estão sendo recontratados pela Netflix para escrever as novelas que vão competir com a Globo, de onde eles eram autores. Só se você puder passar essa informação para ela, por favor.
Just a further information about what we're talking about Globo and Netflix, that recently Globo fired lots of telenovelas authors, which then were hired by Netflix, who are going, they are going to write their very own telenovelas who are going to compete with Global. Just further information on the subject that Dario wanted you to know about.
A lot of Netflix Australia staff have come from the streaming platforms or catch-up platforms of Australian broadcasters and cable subscribers. So they're definitely stealing the staff as well in the same vein.
Okay. It works in the same way.
Yes.
All around the globe. Yes, that's right. Mais algumas perguntas? Mais alguém querendo falar alguma coisa?
A Melina e a Dani estão perguntando aqui um intercâmbio com a Alexia. Elas querem ir para a Austrália, fazer um pós-doutorado lá.
There is a question about Dani Mazu. It's not really a question, it's more like a request. She wants to know if you have some kind of email to keep this talking going on, because she, Dani Rios, and Melina May Marides want to talk more to you about the Brazilian case and make an exchange about their Australian case.
Absolutely, please get in touch. I would love to hear more. We are currently working, Ramon and Amanda, lots are working on a collection called Streaming Stories with lots of case studies from different regions and about different genres that the SVODs, particularly Netflix, have been producing. And it would be wonderful to get some further context for those stories that they're putting together, those case studies. So please reach out. I'd love to hear more and speak to more of you.
Yes. Bom, acho que a gente pode encerrar, João?
Sim, sim.
Então tá, você puder traduzir para mim, por favor. Natália, a gente vai encerrar aqui a nossa mesa, a nossa conferência. Agradecer mais uma vez a todos os presentes, a todas as perguntas que foram feitas, e agradecer principalmente a Alexa e ao Ramon Lobato pela participação, pelo tempo todo dispensado conosco e pela discussão muito legal que foi levada aqui hoje. Realmente, se a gente puder continuar essa discussão, vai ser muito bacana. E muito obrigada novamente. E a gente espera poder contar com vocês pessoalmente aqui no Brasil, em algum momento aí na frente, onde a gente já possa se ver pessoalmente, na próxima conferência, quem sabe. Obrigada.
Obrigado. Thank you, Alexia. Obrigado, Natália. Sempre excelente.
Eu que agradeço, João. Alexa, we are ending this talk. We want to thank all the ones that are watching us, and especially you and Lobato as well, for your participation, for your video, for your timing with us, and for the incredible discussion. And if we could keep the discussion going on, it would be amazing. And we really hope that we can see each other in person next time, perhaps in the next conference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the organizers and Natalia for translating. This is such an amazing setup that you have going on, and I hope this is a future indication of conferences going forward that we can get this dialogue going across languages. Obrigada. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Have a good time, and hope to see you soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.